I'm just throwing no two-part questions. Not sure what to do with that. Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Bruce. And what an honor to be here to share time to talk about your new book. And I appreciate your perspective. If you haven't got his newsletter, it's in the back of the book, you can definitely subscribe to a lot of the items in the book appear in his newsletter. They've got about 20,000 subscribers, so they're pretty well connected and very useful. For myself, Bruce works mostly for First Nations communities, Métis communities. Those are his clients, and I sort of have worked on the other side of the fence, as it were. I cut my teeth working for BC Hydro and working in Indigenous relations, where I learned a lot from Stalo lady, Cheryl Brooks Pathalwit, who helped really grow the Indigenous relations program, not just at BC Hydro, but really across the country. She greenfielded it. It was, and I've bugged her for years. I've said, hey, where did you get all this stuff? And I've tried to look for the source, and she's it. And so it was a really great opportunity for me to learn from Pathalwit, her whole philosophy about Indigenous relations. And so I just say that because in terms of the law, when I'm not a lawyer, he is. And, but I've had I've been fortunate in terms of just working for organizations, getting legal briefings on the other side of the fence, and so we were talking about that in the green room, and just some of the things that I've learned. So I'm hoping to learn a little bit more here this evening, and my job as a moderator. Honestly, I came here tonight thinking I would have a bunch of questions. They'd give me cue cards, and I would read, and I found out that's not how this is going to work at all. They said, yeah, you just start the conversation. So that's what we'll do. And I was trying to think about how do we approach such a large subject. And there's lots of great content. We could talk for days and days just about what is in this book. And but to kick it off, I think maybe some of the contemporary issues. How hard do you want me to go here?
Let's go.
I've tried to ask him a few times, Okay. Timely, the 51st state. How do you think Indigenous rights will play into the 51st state, or maybe Alberta separating, or some of those kinds of things? There you go, hardball for you all early.
Great. Well, thanks, Bob, and thanks to the library for hosting us. Thanks, Patricia. Thanks to Nightwood Editions. They've been supporting me for my first book, Standoff, and my second book, and both Silas and Janine are here. So I really want to say thanks, and thanks to Fleur, who's been helping me get this book out there as much as possible, and thanks to all of you for showing up. Bob and I were talking about this a bit. I'm not shy about spreading my opinions about these things. And the last few weeks, I've been asked a lot about the 51st state, about the threat. And I think I see a lot of Canadians, and there might be some of you here. I'm sure you've got your Canadian flag and you're out there waving it. Fantastic. But also, from an Indigenous perspective, they might have a different view of it, right? And a lot of times it becomes personal. So for me, I've got a piece that I've been working on for my new book, and I've not published it yet. I've not put it out because it's about how, and I think I've titled it, When Canada Annexed My Grandfather's Home. And for Indigenous people, annexation means something else. They've gone through that. They've had their own lands annexed, sometimes from the same threat of the Americans will come and, we've got to expand Canada because of the threat from the United States, right? But I think it's important, particularly for non-Indigenous people, to keep in mind that there's a different perspective on this. One's not right, one's not wrong, but there is a different perspective, particularly from a lot of Indigenous people across the country. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is not just talk about the law, because the law by itself as an abstract thing, I think that's the wrong way to think about the law. I think you have to think about the law historically and based on place. Where you are in a time and a place, you're better to understand the law thinking about it that way. Then it makes it real and you see how it develops. So the 51st state thing, first thing was, I was like, hey, I know a little bit about that from a personal perspective. It's not just about the law. So thanks, Bob.
Really put you on the spot there, thanks. And, I've been thinking about it as well, and Laura and I are working on an article that we're calling placeholder title, Reconciliation in the 51st State. And, I think about my parents and a lot of Indigenous peoples in the country and their families, survivors of residential schools, and I think to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action. Many of those calls had, we want you to learn about the history and the culture and the UN Declaration and those kinds of things. And to me, I thought we're really having a reconciliation moment here right now, where Canadians, if they want you to learn the history because they want you to feel empathetic to the experience they've had in this country for the last 150 years. And if you want to know how it starts, it's somebody, a superpower with way more power than you, wants your stuff because you're not using it in the appropriate manner. And so that's why we're calling it Reconciliation in the 51st State. And to see the rise and the spirit of Canadians and that Canadian spirit, you look at all of those Indigenous nations and that's how they feel about, the colonization experience. So.
Yeah, I do a lot of talks across the country, and just like Bob does, and the best compliments I get back, or when people come up and say, I really enjoyed that, you didn't sound like a lawyer. I'm like, oh, perfect. Hopefully in court, I sound a little bit more like a lawyer, but one of the talks I give is on this point about people showing up and just taking the land, and I use this couch surfing analogy. Someone shows up, knocks on your door. Oh, can I sleep on your sofa for a night? Oh, yeah, sure, fine. And then they're there a second night, a third night. They're like, oh, they're getting comfortable. And then you come home, they're in your fridge. You're like, whoa, they're really comfortable. They're taking a shower. It's like, oh. And then they say, oh, can we sit down on the sofa? We need to talk about reconciliation. And you're like, what the hell? I invited you in so you can sleep on my sofa. I wanted to, make sure you weren't cold and starving outside, and now we have to reconcile? What is that about? My first book, Standoff, there's a blurb on the front. I can't remember exactly what it says, but it says something like, reconciliation is crap. Or something like that, because I think we really need to be critical about these things. I was talking to Bob about this book, and I reread some of it and think, oh, I must have had my cranky pants on that morning because that's harsh. I think we need to be critical. It's not just accepting the feel good reconciliation stuff. I've got these shirts that say, if reconciliation's making you feel good, you're doing it wrong. It's got to make you feel uncomfortable. And so I think for some people, particularly some judges, when they read my book, or lawyers, it'll make them feel a little uncomfortable, and that's a good thing.
There you go. And if we start to bring in it a little bit from that, that's the genesis of the relationship, and it really is a a law relationship. You talk about the Royal Proclamation, and the foundation of the law, as I understand it, is really documents like the Doctrine of Discovery, the Royal Proclamation. They really guide us. When Delgamuukw came out in December of 1997, the Supreme Court said title exists and rights exist, and here's a test to prove it. And I can remember, some of the people that I was teaching at the time, well, how can I do that? Aboriginal title has never existed in law before. Is this like a mamby-pamby leftist judge making up law? So just some thoughts maybe on the genesis of the law, and because I think what you're talking about really has layers and layers and foundations.
Yeah, so that's exactly, thanks, Bob, how the book is laid out. It's a question, and then I have a one sentence answer, and then I've got about enough that you could usually read in about a minute to expand it, and then I'm done. I'm on to the next question. I joke with people, it's written for people like me that have a short attention span. I want to get in, get it, get out. On to the next one. So I deal with a lot of those kinds of questions. What is the doctrine of discovery? Short answer, it's the foundation of Canada, that it's based on a lie. Someone can show up and steal your land, displace your laws, and then say, hey, now let's reconcile. Right? That's basically what it is. In Canadian courts, they don't like to use that because it's kind of a four-letter word, the doctrine of discovery. It's been reputed all around the world. So here we call it the assertion of crown sovereignty. That sounds safe. Means the same damn thing, right? So there's a whole bunch of those kinds of questions, and what I've been really thankful for is the responses I get from people that aren't, they aren't doing the work Bob and I are doing. They aren't lawyers. They aren't in government. They're just like all of you, just people interested. And when I get a response saying, thank you so much, because I've been fed a bunch of lies my entire life. And now that you explain it, that's so helpful. And that's what I was trying to do, is just to raise that conversation so it's not based on misinformation, but you can have opinions, but try to source them out a little bit and see if there are some facts to support them.
I like it. And, some of the practical questions you would get around this subject would be, Bruce, how is it they can have any legal rights other than the rights we give them? Because after all, didn't we conquer them? So
yeah, well, I got a colleague of mine out in New Brunswick this week. We have a case for the Mi'kmaq there about title, and we're still facing those kinds of arguments. Weren't the Mi'kmaq conquered? It's unbelievable. And it's an example how this country is different depending where you are. Most of you, I think a lot of you are from BC. BC's West Coast kind of thinking. In a lot of parts of the country, and Bob knows this well, there's a lot of those old racist ideas are more at the forefront, and people aren't shy about saying them, how variable it is. One I get a lot, like Bob is saying, why do Indigenous people have special rights? Can't we all be equal? And so it's explaining to people, no, because Indigenous people were here first. And there's law around that. There was law, British law at the time, not cooked up law. No, this was the law. So many people love to talk about the rule of law, right? Woo, the rule of law is so good. Well, respect it then. That is the law. That you respect people's interest in the land. In BC, it was ignored for 150 years, continues to be ignored unless First Nations have the resources to fight it out in court.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah, and just for people, you do have a big difference between the East Coast and the West Coast. You know, Mi'kmaq have 500 years of colonization experience. I think you refer to it as a colonization project. But when you get to the West Coast, it really, you know, the assertion of Crown sovereignty happens in 1846, and that is obviously an important time. And it was James Douglas that asserted that Crown sovereignty, and according to the doctrine, it really means that this is ours now. We're here, and you know, if you look at a map of treaties, which is how we were dealing with it initially, we were negotiating treaties on a nation-to-nation basis with the Mi'kmaq, and all of the people as we worked our way westward across the continent. You will see that that's what was happening. So not a lot of conquering, in case you haven't really dialed in on that. And I was confused by that too, because I watched way too many John Wayne movies, you know, when I was growing up, and I thought there were Indian wars, and just none of that applies to Canada. And I think that's what you're getting at when you talk about it's a myth, it's untrue.
Yeah, that's, I remember that being a kid, that Johnny Horton song about the War of 1812. And how it was such a shock for me. You know, they fought the bloody British, and then when I learned later that we were the British, because I was like, that sounds so great, you know. But it's a good example of understanding the differences, right, between the United States, Canada. The whole thing now going on with anti-Trump, 51st state stuff. I think that's good if people realize what the differences are that all Canadians should be proud of, that makes Canada different from the United States. And one of the fundamental one is that Aboriginal rights are protected under the Canadian Constitution. That is not the case south of the border. If Canadians are going to be proud of this country, be proud of that. That's a thing to be proud of. And so when you get legislation, and Bob and I were talking about this a bit, like in BC, Bill 15, federally, Bill C5, Canadians need to stand up and say no. No, because you're removing the processes to ensure Aboriginal rights will be respected. They can't change the Constitution, but they can hollow it out. And that's what that legislation does. Because yes, it's there, but it means that First Nations then can only rely on the courts to protect their rights. It's forcing them into the courts. And what really upsets me is that then Indigenous people will be blamed. You're standing in the way of protecting us from Donald Trump. You're standing in the way of building a pipeline and economic security. You're a troublemaker. How long have Indigenous people heard that? And then it ends up really gradually violence against Indigenous people, racism against Indigenous people. Land defenders will be criminalized. Most often they are women. Indigenous women will be facing militarized police forces based on these laws. And so it's important to know where they can lead to.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just entrenched in what you were saying. I'm like, what am I going to say? I
was worked up.
I wasn't thinking about what I was going to say next. But, you know, I did have a thought about Calder, and I know you talk about Calder, you know, and I remember distinctly one of the questions being about, in the Calder era, was, you know, why do we have to deal with this now? Why are we doing all these court cases and blockades and that kind of stuff? Why didn't you people deal with it in the past? Can I say you people? Like maybe just for the sake of devil's advocate, why you people? But yeah. So any ideas?
Right, because it's there because of this long history of denial, and provincial governments change. What doesn't change is denial. The NDP denies Aboriginal title now. That's not changed. The Social Credit did. The Liberals did. How they deny it, maybe in a kinder, gentler way, but it's still based on denial. And that's really important. It's important for all people in BC to know that, and that the provincial government sends their lawyers into court. I'm there. Some of them might be here today. And they're arguing, no, Aboriginal title doesn't exist. That's what they're doing. So all this talk about, we've moved on somewhere different. No, not really. It can be done. You can recognize it. The HIDA agreement from last year, wow. But how many of those are we going to get? Not very many. There was one with the Teltan last year, right? Oh, okay, we're going to say that we won't build this mine unless we get Teltan consent. Wow, that sounds good. Except they knew they're going to get Teltan consent. That's the only reason they signed the darn thing. I want to see the provincial government sign one like that where they don't know. Or there's a First Nation that doesn't want a mine. Are they going to sign a consent agreement with them? No way. They will not, because it's still based on denial. And that's the fundamental way the law works in BC and across the country, is deny, deny, deny.
And what if you can't deny it?
Well, there is no shame. There is no shame. I see it all the time. Bob and I were talking about this a bit before we started. You get governments, I've seen it federally and provincially, literally patting themselves on the back. Look how the law's developed in such a positive way to recognize Indigenous rights. And I talk about this in my book, how the law has developed. You have to realize that's because of the hard work of Indigenous people. That's based on the resistance from provincial and federal governments. That's why the law is developed. And importantly, it's Indigenous people taking the chance every time. It's so unfair because provincial and federal governments have nothing to lose. They can make any cockamamie argument they want. If they lose, oh well, okay, we have no shame. But for Indigenous people, if they lose, it can cause huge harm for them. That's why we need to continue to encourage, it's funny because I'm a lawyer, but I really don't want these lawsuits. Indigenous people file the lawsuits as a last resort. They take a huge risk. We should be able to find ways to negotiate meaningfully outcomes, not force Indigenous people constantly into the courts.
Thanks. It brings to mind where we are flipping back and forth, and you do have a resource in the book around Indigenous peoples and Aboriginal peoples, and it was good that Jorge talked about being from another country, but I was thinking he's Indigenous. He's from Mexico, maybe way back in his family somewhere. But the book also uses Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal titles. So can you help people just understand the difference between the two? Maybe even give them some guidance, which term to use. And
I think I'm a bit of a sucker for punishment. I sat down a couple years ago over my morning coffee, thinking I'm going to draw a Venn diagram for the different categories of indigeneity under Canadian law. Oh my God, I thought my head was going to explode. It's crazy. And I know this stuff a little bit. And still, I had all these overlapping circles, and I'm like, okay, I think I got it, but no, it's still not right here. So in the book, like Bob says, I have sections, or who is an Indian? What is Aboriginal? What is a First Nation? Because that causes so much confusion. You know, what is an Indian band compared to a First Nation? Who are the Métis? Don't get me started. Drives me nuts, right? So I try in the book to lay out these different categories to explain it. Janine and Silas, my publishers, encouraged me to put a glossary in, right? And we're like, oh, okay, I guess so. But now I've talked to a lot of people. They think it's really helpful. But I think what's important there to keep in mind, and Bob knows this well, these are categories imposed on Indigenous people, right? You know, there are Indigenous people know who they are. You know, they're Haisla, they're Mi'kmaq, they're Anishinaabe, they're Cree, they're Musqueam. You know, they know these terms are all imposed by the colonizers on Indigenous people. And it's one of the things that is used as a form of oppression of Indigenous people. How do you fit into these different categories? Can you show us how you fit? Are you an Indian under the Indian Act? Aha, you're not. You know, because you're caught by the second generation rule, so you're out of it now. So it's all very complicated, but I try to lay it out, because one of the things I've always been committed to, that lawyers should be able to explain this stuff. And if you're explaining it and someone doesn't understand what you're saying, the fault is yours, not the person you're talking to. You're not explaining it well enough. You should be able to simplify it and explain it. So that's what I do as best as possible.
Excellent, excellent. So we are in a library. There's probably some book people here. Capitalize the A, capitalize the I, the P, you know, some of the S on the end. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, sure. Just the one of the things that I talk about is the difference between Indigenous law and Aboriginal law. Because there's a few, I get invited to conferences all the time, right? And a few years ago, I started getting invited to speak at an Indigenous law conference. And I'm like, I think you got the wrong person. Why the hell are you phoning me? I don't know about Indigenous law. I know about Aboriginal law, i.e. the colonizers' laws. I went to a colonizer law school. I know about the Indian Act. I know about the common law. I know about the Constitution. That's the law that I know about. I don't know Anishinaabe law, right? I don't know Dene law. I don't know Cree law. Indigenous nations have their own laws, and that's separate. And it's important to know that, because if not, the colonizers win. If Indigenous law just becomes a synonym for Aboriginal law, oh my Lord, what? There's no space left then for Indigenous people to reinvigorate their nation's own laws. So just, you know, Indigenous people or peoples, we get this a lot, like Bob is talking about, right? When we're saying Usually an Indigenous people is like Indigenous nation. Right? There are different Indigenous nations across the country. So it's important to know the difference. First Nations, that's a term now that's been co-opted to refer to Indian Act bands. You'll hear this a lot. Oh, there are, 600 and some first.
Don't get me started.
Don't get me started, exactly. Those are Indian Act bands. Those are creations under the Indian Act by the federal government. They can uncreate them. They decide who's in, who's not. Like, that's a colonizer thing. And it's really caused a lot of confusion through the use. I get some clients, they won't adopt it. They're like, no, we are the Indian band. It's important to know we're part of a larger nation, but we are an Indian band because we operate under the colonizer's laws.
I like it. And there's some real, and I was just kind of being obnoxious more than anything in terms of how many bands there actually are. Because I can remember in my hydro days, we were doing some consultation in the South Interior, and we had a nation show up. We got a list from the Crown. Here's who you need to talk to. And so we sent out letters, invited them to a meeting. And when we got there, we did a roundtable. Who are you? What do you hope to get out of this process? And we got the 11 communities we were looking for. And one other person stood up and said, "Hi, I'm Marilyn from the Sinaiks Nation. I'm really glad you're here, BC Hydro, because we want to talk to you about your water use planning and the possibility of infringing on our Section 35 rights. And we don't want you to infringe on our Section 35 rights. And so we're glad you're here." And our community relations people were scrambling. Sinaiks. We're like, our apologies. We didn't send you a letter. We'd just like to say we're sorry. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Well, a little while ago, which turned out to be 1955 or 56, a little while ago, Indian Affairs declared us administratively extinct. But we're still here, still have our land, still have our territory, and we're really glad you're here to consult with us. And so we're looking forward to a great conversation with you, BC Hydro, and back to Hydroland. Bruce, I haven't told you this story. Yeah. We're back to Hydroland. Sinaiks, we're in a panic. Hydro's in a panic, right? And well, what are we going to do? We got to go talk to Indian Affairs. They're the ones that declared them extinct. That's where they would have fallen. And so off to INAC. Hey, we had some folks show up. They talked about you guys declaring them administratively extinct. Just wondering, guidance, thoughts, ideas, whatever you got. We're here to listen. And they were like, whoa, you couldn't have stumbled upon something bigger if you tried. I mean, the policy considerations, the legal ramifications, the financial issues, like, wow. And they actually said we'd be hard pressed to talk to them. And so we left the meeting, Bruce, and we're like, that was weird. We actually asked them, what should BC Hydro do? And they were saying we would be hard. They were talking about themselves. We're like, okay, that's just weird. So we went to our Attorney General, showed up to our meeting. We talked to the feds. We're wondering, what should we do? And the Attorney General's office said, what did the feds say? Okay, well, here's what they said. And it was kind of like, well, that's what we're saying too. And I was like, and we had this really great rights and title lawyer, Rob Carpenter. He sat us down and he said, look, I'm really concerned with what you're all thinking here. Engineers, pinky ring, builder types. You're thinking both levels of government have just told you not to talk to the Sinaiks Nation. And I think it's wrong. I think we've got to talk to them. And he said, but I'll do whatever you want. I'm a lawyer. I'm at your service. But I'm just going to tell you what's going to happen. We're going to go into a courtroom. I don't know if you've ever been there. He's giving us a hard time. Don't know if you've ever been there. They're going to sit on that side. We're going to sit on this side. There's going to be a lane. There's going to be a fence. The judge is going to be up here. And we're going to argue they're not here. Do you see my problem? He said, I'll do it. Don't get me wrong. I'll do it. We're gonna argue not here. So you got a case in there.
Yeah, so that's a really good example, that connection between the law and history. So that story that Bob's talking about, that became a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, the Desatel decision, and I've got a short summary in there. And it's an example about, coming back around to the 51st state stuff, this whole thing where colonizers draw a line. You draw the border at the 51st state, at the 51st parallel, or the 49th, and then what about Indigenous people that are on both sides, right? And this was a fascinating case because it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and I had the good fortune to participate, and the court trying to figure out who the hell are the Aboriginal people of Canada. You think they would have decided that before, but no. So this was the first time where the court had to say, can someone who's not a citizen and doesn't have a right of residence, can they be part of the Aboriginal people of Canada? And the court said yes. And it was a combination of law, history, that, yeah, Canada must stand for something more. And I remember I got called by American Geographic, is that what it's called? And they wanted to talk about this case. They're from South Africa. What the hell is this about? What? There are Americans who have constitutional rights in Canada? Yeah, they have actually more secure rights than they do in their own country. That's hard to get your mind around, right? So it's a good example of these are the kind of questions that end up at the Supreme Court. I'm so fortunate to do this work because you're there like, okay, I've never seen this one before. I wonder how this works. And you don't talk just about the law. That's not what you do as much at the Supreme Court. What you do is you talk about what the law should be. What should it be? And one of the things that I try to do in the book is explain how the law's developed. So hopefully we can have a better conversation about what it should be going forward.
I like it. And the backdrop was they were declared administratively extinct. They did have, the border wasn't there, so they're part of a tribe in the States, and they moved mainly to Colville, and we're living there. But we're defined as U.S. Indians. American Indians is the terminology that they have down there, or Native Americans. And really, really good stuff. But I just got the 2-minute notice from way in the back, and we're going to actually open up the floor for some questions now. And I think what I'll do is I'll start up there, and I'll come forward, and then we'll try and get in as many as we can. Now, I'm told we're only here till 10:30 tonight, so I'm going to try and keep it. And I think that's why the two-part question was not going to be allowed. But coming way back here, we got a hand up here. Yeah, perfect. I got to say 9 words or less.
Cool. Are there distinct differences between rights extended to Indigenous and Aboriginal peoples in the provinces versus the territories?
Oh, yeah. Really good question. So I was up in the Northwest Territories last week talking to clients there. So it really depends where you are. If you have one of the so-called historical treaties, like Treaty 8, which extends into BC, also extends into the Northwest Territories. So you can have treaty rights, right, under there. You also have rights for some nations under a modern treaty. So you have those modern treaty rights. So those are different because instead of saying, or at least this is a government's petition, you can rely on your Aboriginal title rights. what the government's position is, no, now you rely on the rights that are written down within that document along the lines of some of the modern treaties in BC. So it really depends which nation in the Northwest Territory you're talking about.
Yep, there. Here, I'll pass it along.
Oh, it's all recorded? Yeah, hey, nice talk. I appreciate it. Was there a question in the book that you found particularly difficult to answer?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm going to need to write an answer to that question now. What's the most difficult one? I think there are some I find not intellectually difficult, but when I write the answers out, there's a lot of this stuff gets really personal because you know people that have been involved in this and you know the history, and there's a lot of frustration comes out a lot. I've got one question I put into the book. It's, what is the Indian problem? Because that's what you get, right? This is a historical thing. There's an Indian problem. And so I wrote about how there is none. I think the short one sentence answer that I put was, there is no Indian problem. The problem is Canada. And then I explain how that works to oppress Indigenous people. They're blamed for this, they're blamed for that. So that was the kind of question when I wrote the answer. You can't completely detach yourself from this work. And I can only work on those for so long. And then I find I can get very upset and I need to go for a walk, do something else.
Thank you. Don't want to see him in his cranky pajamas. That's all I know.
Hi. Yeah, my whole family is like Irish background, and I'm constantly shocked at how little English and British people know about colonization there. And I think the same is true here, especially above a certain age. More recently, with stuff like kneecap, it's come into the conversation. Kneecap were in court today. But I'm curious about what you think about how important the sort of quote-unquote court of public opinion will be in Indigenous rights in Canada and people talking about that.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. I think that's really important. One of the reasons I wrote the book is I think particularly non-Indigenous people need to be better informed about this. And from my experience working in the law, what's really effective if you want to get involved is make sure politicians know what your views are. I tell people a lot, I can have as many clients as you can think of tell politicians, no, this is wrong, that's wrong. But when they start hearing it from non-Indigenous people, they get more worried. They start to get concerned. Oh, maybe I'm not going to win my seat the next time around. This seems like it's percolating. I got to get on top of this. So I think it's really important for us all not to be silent about it. Like with Bill C-15 or Bill C-5 now, we got to speak out about this. They take advantage of silence. We need to speak out. Thanks.
Hi. You were talking about how the law is kind of developed in a way, and it might be a bit of a loaded question, but I'm curious in your perspective of like if the potential to have Indigenous laws kind of integrated or working with colonial law, acknowledging, of course, that like all Indigenous groups are different and they all have different laws. But yeah, just your perspective.
Right. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the most exciting work going on right now is not around Aboriginal law. I think the most exciting work is the work that Indigenous nations are doing across the country to reinvigorate their own laws. Like, it's cool, man. It's fantastic. And there's more space growing. One of the cases I give a short summary of in my book is the child and welfare and family services decision from the Supreme Court a couple of years ago, where the court accepted that the federal government could just enforce Indigenous laws as a federal law. They can incorporate a law passed by an Indigenous nation and enforce it as a federal law, which is really important because for most Indigenous people across the country, the laws that affect them the most aren't federal laws, they're provincial. It's provincial laws that affect them the most. And I explain it in the book, the way the Canadian Constitution works. There's federal laws, there's provincial laws, but in certain situations, the federal law can trump the provincial law and push the provincial law to the side. And so this is what the Supreme Court said here, was that, oh, well, the feds can incorporate an Indigenous law around child and family services, and that displaces the provincial law. Sorry, province of BC, you no longer have jurisdiction. That is powerful. And that gives me a lot of hope that that's a way that the law can develop, I think, in a really positive way.
Did you say Donald Trump? I'm sorry. Oh, there. And then we got 2 more rows after this. We're almost done.
Well, thanks for the conversation. I was curious, I'm not sure if this fits in the legalistic framework, but I was curious what your thoughts are on the terminology of economic reconciliation. I hear legislators talk about this, and on the surface it sounds like something positive, but I expect that there's something useful to say about it.
Yeah, I don't think I'm being cynical, but I could see how quickly that can develop into a conversation or a dialogue saying, oh, well, you're now a troublemaker because we offered you money as part of economic reconciliation, and you've turned it down, so you're standing in the way. When Indigenous people, a lot of times, yeah, that is a component, the economic side, but it's not the only one. And a lot of Indigenous people, all depending on what the circumstance might be, well, it doesn't matter how much money. I got a responsibility to the past and I got a responsibility to the future. You're not turning that lake into a tailings pond. You're not doing it. And so what, are they going to be then categorized as offside with economic reconciliation? I think the economic side should always be a part of it. But it can't just be the focus, and if you're not buying into it, somehow you're then being reasonable. That's what concerns me with that kind of approach.
How are we doing for time, Jorge?
One more. Make sure we get down. Okay. Two more. One, and we're done.
Thank you so much to both of you and your families while you're here tonight. I really appreciate that. Can you speak about land back and how we can participate?
Yeah, thanks. So that's one of the questions I pose in the book. What is land back? And I realized that most of my answer is about what it's not. Because you get so many politicians saying, oh, this is land back, no, it's not. Like comprehensive claims, that's not land back. Additions to reserves, that's not land back. Land back is peeling back that lie. Bob and I were talking about it, the doctrine of discovery. Land back is acknowledging that that's a lie. And so what we need to do is recognize two things. One, there's an economic component to the land, and Indigenous people have a right to benefit, but also, really importantly, make decisions about their land. That's what land back, I think, is about. We often characterize it as Indigenous sovereignty. It's making decisions about the land. It's peeling back those lies. And I think when we get saying it's something else is dangerous. It's not that. I think what non-Indigenous people, one of the things to do is to call out those lies all the time, as often as possible. Wait a minute, it sounds good, but is that really what this should be about? So land back, I think, is about those basic truths that Captain Cook sailed into Nootka Sound and claimed the land. That's the lie that we need to deal with. Yeah, thanks.
I'd like to ask about the legality of the comprehensive treaty process from the point of view of ethnic cleansing, because there is a clause in the treaty process, a non-negotiable clause, that nullifies the Indian Act and therefore extinguishes Canadian Indian nationality. And I'm wondering, is that legal? Because it's ethnic cleansing. This is their objective in the treaty process, to do away with Indians.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I've got a piece in the book, What Are Comprehensive Claims? It sounds boring, right? But this is fundamental, because these comprehensive claims, they're about extinguishing title and rights to the land. That's what they're about. They're about substituting. Instead of recognizing these rights, it's saying, no, you'll never be able to rely, and now you'll need to fit into this box. I get flack from a lot of federal government people. They're like, we've changed it. It's not like that. Nah, you just change the wording. It's the same damn thing, right? And the ethnic cleansing thing, it's not just through that, but it's through the operation of the Indian Act. Because and I explain it, most people don't know what you need to do to become and get registered and maintain being registered as an Indian. And there are a lot of Indigenous people out there hanging on by their fingernails because of the second generation cutoff rule. And a lot of nations, First Nations, have shown that if you project this out over 20, 30 years, there will not be any Indians left. None. Zero. The last point on this is that that's why it's really important for Indigenous nations to take control of their own citizenship and not be defined by the Indian Act. Not be defined by that, because it excludes so many of their family members, and it's also the road to extinguishment as a people. So, thanks. I think our time's up. Thank you so much.